It's the If everyone could take their seats, please.
Go ahead, whack it.
Oh, yeah, you bet.
Give her a whack.
Give it a whack.
Well, they're all different kind of balls. I mean, if you're gonna do this the whole time, that's fine.
Good morning, everyone. I call to order this committee of the whole meeting for the Thompson-Nicola Regional District for Friday, December 16th. And I am about to say what might be the most popular thing I say over the course of the next year. There is more coffee on its way. Just to set everyone's mind at rest on that point. Excuse me. So the TNRD acknowledges that we connect with many First Nations communities across our vast regional district and today are located on the Tecumloops-Secwepemc territory, situated within the unceded ancestral lands of the Secwepemc Nation. The TNRD appreciates the partnership that we have with Tecumloops-Secwepemc and respect the territory and land on which we gather today. We have the minutes of the October 7th Committee of the Whole meeting.
So moved.
Thank you. Second. Director Blackwell, are there any errors or omissions? Seeing and hearing none. All those in favor? That is carried. And without further ado, we move into a presentation on the regional growth strategy by the General Manager of Development Services. It's over to you, Regina.
Good morning, everybody. I hope you all had a good sleep. We've got the lights down low, so that's the other reason I hope you've had a good sleep. Yes, my name is Regina Sedilkova, and I am here with one of our planners, Ursula Wallace, and Jamie Vieira will be presenting what you have before you. And we actually thought it would be good, we don't give you a lot of paper, to give you the little booklet. We have about, altogether, Jamie, probably about 45 minutes. And my apologies to those of you who've heard this before. I think it was in October, a few months back. This time, that was a partial report. This time it is the full comprehensive for our fourth monitoring report. I'm very proud to say we do these in-house with our existing staff off the corner of our desks. So before we begin, I do want to say just a couple things. Oops, yeah, oops, those fancy PowerPoint. A few things about our actual regional growth strategy, because what we're presenting and focusing on today is the monitoring report, which emanates from the bigger document. This document will, in your agenda, in your covering report, I provided some details. We're not going to do that verbally here. We have only so much time. However, we will be coming back to you in spring of 2023 with a decision that was deferred from the previous board to this board, when and how and if to open it up and amend it and update it. So there's no need to make that decision now. It's just good to be aware of it, that it's coming back. In this case, our report today is mostly statistics and numbers. So there's really nothing to debate. Our regional growth strategy is here. There's a link in it to the report. It's basically 15 pages. There's a page of context right after the introduction and vision, which is a bit out of date. It's 10 years old now. But a lot of the policies, which are under sort of 6 headings, here's one, human settlement. Those were updated in 2000. I think we started in 2011 and it was adopted in 2012. Part of that process created a set of 10 indicators. So that's what this monitoring report is about, those 10 indicators and how those indicators refer back to the policies and goals in this document. As I said yesterday, this is our highest most general planning document. It's very general. It's an agreement or kind of contract between all the rural areas and the municipalities. I do write a summary and some particulars in your covering report, which I'm not going to, again, I'm not going to repeat all of those. But when we come back to you, there's really two options: to leave it, or three options. Leave it as it is. This would be in the spring. Look at a minor amendment or look at a major amendment. And there's a lot of, the Local Government Act has a lot of prescriptions on what that is and how you do it. So in terms of our 10 indicators, here they are. The monitoring report is actually longer and more involved than the RGS itself. And we will speak to these. These are the numbers on these in that order. And in terms of the timeline, so our RGS is now 22 years old. There's the review that was adopted in 2013. We started that in late 2010, I believe. In 2014, we set the indicators. So here we are on our fourth monitoring report. And before I turn over the first indicator population to Ursula, who's working hard on increasing our population rate here, just saying, that's commitment. We're not going to go over all the sources in the report. They are there in footnotes or in endnotes. If you have any questions, where did you get these numbers? Or if you think we made a mistake, please come to us after the meeting and tell us, or we will check them at that point. In terms of questions, if you have a quick and easy clarification question through the chair, if I may, they can just interject. If you want discussion or have detailed questions, I would please ask you to hold those till the end. And I think that's it, my turn.
All right, thank you, Regina. So our first and most critical indicator is population. This indicator is so important as it has implications for all of the other indicators, and it's the reason why it is always monitored in all of the different reports across BC. So other regional districts always monitor this indicator. The data here is from 2019 to 2021, and it is sourced from BC Stats, which tend to have more accurate data than the census. The population changes between these years have been overall subtle, but there have been notable population increases in Logan Lake, Clearwater, and Sun Peaks. Here we have the overall TNRD population increase, which is for the same years. So between 2019 and 2021, we saw a population increase in the overall region of about 1.5%, which is comparable or very close to the city of Kamloops increase, which was 1.6%. And Kamloops and Merritt are charted here separately due to legibility, as their population sizes are higher than the other municipalities. And just noting that the TNRD overall numbers include all electoral areas, unincorporated areas, as well as municipalities. So this slide is showing data from the census, and it's over a longer time span, so over 5 years between the two census years. And what we're seeing is that between 2016 and 2021, there was an over 8% change of rate of population change. And what's particularly interesting is when we plot that against the population rate of change compared to BC and Canada, we see that TNRD's rate of change is higher. Another aspect that we look at with population is age distribution. So here the data is also from Stats Canada, and we see ages going up the chart. So on the bottom, we have the lowest age groups, and then going up to the oldest at the top. The TNRD numbers are shown in green, and BC is shown in blue. And what's critical here is the difference between the blue and the green, and that's showing that a greater difference in demographic makeup between the TNRD and the province. So what's important here is this section of the graph where we see a greater difference, and it's showing that proportionally, the TNRD has a lower population of working age class, which is ages between 15 to about 64. And as Regina will get into more detail in the economy indicator, that of course has big implications for that indicator. So this demographic information is vital, and it ties back to our RGS goal. Our population goal is to recognize the importance of domestic and international immigration and attracting young families to develop our labor force. We know that our natural birth rate or fertility rate has been declining. And in BC right now, it's the average fertility rate is 1.2 children per woman, which is quite a bit below the replacement rate of 2.1 children. So why is this important? Well, if we want to embrace and encourage growth, we need to plan strategically and work to achieve other RGS goals and improve quality of life factors, because essentially our region is competing with other regions in the province to attract migrants, specifically a steady workforce. So that's just to keep in the back of your mind as we work through the other indicators. And with that, I'll pass it back to Regina to discuss housing.
Okay. So in our RGS, there's a lot of policy and goals set out for settlement patterns. This is a required content under the Local Government Act for RGSs. So we're looking at what are people building and where are we building them? Without getting into too much detail, the general policy is that new housing will be directed to established communities. So whether that's Blue River, Savanaw improvement districts, places like Tobiano with water and sewer, or municipalities, rather than all being in rural areas. So here are our numbers going back 5 years. This is the total of new housing starts by the number of units for the whole TNRD. And a housing unit, that can be a suite in a basement. It can be a unit in an apartment building, townhouse. It can be a single family house, or if it's a duplex, it would be 2 units. So we had a real spike in 2021. And if you recall at least for, this is all TNRD, but your report, that's your building permit stats that was in your agenda yesterday. Our numbers for 2022 will be out at the end of this month, and we're going to be very near what they were in 2021. However, 2020 and 2021 had a real spike in the city of Kamloops. So let's look at that. So this is the housing by again, the number of units in the municipalities. And looking at 2020 there, that was a real spike. Most of those, like 86% of those, 96% of those in 2020 were in Kamloops, Sun Peaks, and Merritt. And then 86% of the 666 in 2021 were also in those 3 municipalities. Now, going forward, what are we building? So in this graph, we look at, and again, this is all TNRD, whether it's a manufactured home in red, a single family dwelling, so detached SFD, or multifamily units, so that's 3 or more. And we see why that spike was in 2020. Those were multifamily dwelling units, and really to address housing need, which is definitely a priority in the province, to get the number we need, multifamily dwelling units is the fastest and most affordable way to achieve that. I will say also on manufactured homes, this just looks at the 3 most recent years because we try to make the data new and active. And so the data rolls with each of these monitoring reports. But I do go back sometimes 10 or 20 years. The number of manufactured homes has steadily been increasing and is pretty well double what it was 10 years ago. And I think that's because A, it's hard to get a contractor. 2, especially in rural areas, most of those manufactured homes were in electoral areas. The other thing is the sort of provincial rules around the Homeowner Protection Act make it really hard to build your own home without meeting that criteria. It's easier to get a manufactured home, and in some cases, they're just more affordable. So now looking where folks are building. This is a indicator we've been looking at from our first report. Each of those little icons is 10 units. And so, I mean, if it's a race, I guess Kamloops wins. When we look at what an established community is, it's not necessarily a municipality. Like it's anywhere, and maybe perhaps we can be criticized for casting this net too broadly because it's anywhere where there's services. So water, sewer. So for example, Tobiano or Whitecroft would be an established community. But we also include anywhere within a fire protection area. So for example, parts of Pritchard, which are totally, there's no shopping, there's no schools, there's no water, well, on the south side of the river. It's on-site water, wells and septic. But I would argue that's actually rural. So again, there you have the numbers by electoral area and municipality. Now, stepping back and looking at a kind of analysis, 2/3, you saw the majority was definitely within the boundary of the city of Kamloops, but 2/3 of all housing starts in 2020 and 2021 were within a daily commute of Kamloops. So 30 minutes from, say, this building or downtown Kamloops, not the boundaries, because Kamloops boundaries are quite extensive. And last, this is not an indicator, but we thought it was interesting because it provides some security for our region. We have a higher rate of outright home ownership. So people aren't less impacted by what happens with the interest rates. So outright owned versus BC, we're almost 1/3. And we have a lower proportion of renters. And when we get into the economy and the jobs, we did hear a lot from a lot of our large employers saying they need employees. They have people who are qualified, but they can't find a place to live in our area. So that rolls into the sort of broader policy in the regional growth strategy. And I will turn it over to Ursula.
All right, so our third indicator is transportation. This data is brand new. It just came in the end of November, so it wasn't available in our first presentation that we gave. And our transportation data is important. One of the requirements in an RGS is to set targets for greenhouse gas emissions reductions. So this information just helps to shed light on, you know, how are residents in our areas commuting. So the TNRD chart is on the left. 82% of residents are commuting as a driver, and that's notably higher than the provincial rate of 73%. Followed by driving, the second most common form of commuting is as a vehicle passenger, so carpooling. 3% are taking public transit, 6% are walking, 1% are cycling, and 2% are taking other forms. So commuting by vehicle has gradually increased over the census years. So with each census from 2006, 2011, 2016, the percentage has gone up. But what's interesting is that we now have data on working from home. So even though the mode share of commute is more popular to be driving, it's not necessarily driving as frequently. And we'll get into the working from home stats in just a moment. But first, I just want to look at commute duration. So this chart compares commute times in electoral areas versus municipalities and then the province overall. So not surprisingly, residents in our electoral areas have longer commutes which are 30 minutes or longer than residents in municipalities. And residents in our EAs also have longer commutes than BC residents overall. On the flip side, residents in our municipalities have more of the shorter commutes, so the commutes which are under 30 minutes, and less longer commutes than BC residents overall. Working from home data. So we were wondering, what does working from home mean? So we did check the census definition, and it's defined as persons whose job is located at the same building as their residents, persons who live and work on the same farm, and workers who spend most of their work week working from home. So it was a little bit vague. It's saying most of the work week. So we just took that to mean that, you know, if someone is working full-time 5 days a week, that if they were working from home 3 or more days, that would be considered working from home. So electoral areas E, L, N, and O surpassed the BC norm of working from home, which was 23%. We also looked at working from home in our municipalities. Working from home was less prevalent in our municipalities, with the exception of Sun Peaks, which also surpassed the BC norm at 25%. So with working from home, as I mentioned, we may be driving more as a form of commuting compared to the other modes, but not necessarily as frequently. So not necessarily Monday to Friday. And the working from home stats is something that we'd like to monitor in future reports, as it does have implications for a lot of other factors of our RGS report. So when it comes to greenhouse gas reductions, air quality, and it can also affect the value of homes in rural areas as well. So it is a metric that we'd like to monitor in future.
So indicator 4, economy. The RGS goals are to secure for our region well-paying, stable, secure, and diverse jobs. And so looking at this is why we look at them. In the report, you have this is one of the things, thanks, that wasn't available in November or October, pardon me. It came out at the end of November, and it was a graph on page, this one, I don't know what that is. So that is, we have that data. We just looked for we looked at the last 3 census periods, and then we looked at some information from Work BC. Now for economy, the census lumps us in with the Okanagan. Not all the BC stats do that, but the census does. So some of these numbers on here have to be read with a pause, because it would include Kelowna, Penticton, all that area. So, but looking back, our top 3 jobs in our region by opportunity and demand is construction, retail, and healthcare. And those 3 have been there since we've started this, but they tend to change order. So because of our little building boom of the last few years, construction is at the top of the list. In terms of employment loss sectors, so we've seen forestry used to be lumped in with all resource, but they break out mining and quarrying, which has gone up slightly. But forestry and resource, so forestry would be hunting, agriculture has gone down. And the other thing that was sort of, for me, it was notable, some of our softer sectors that have to do with culture and community in some cases. So info and cultural industries, arts and entertainment, they're small to begin with, but they're inching down. Now that could have to do with COVID as well, certainly since the last census, but there has been a pattern of that. And we also reached out and spoke to some of our main sectors in the TNRD. I mean, New Gold didn't mind being named, and they're in the report, but other ones just provided comments about how hard it is to get staff, especially in where it's labor related. And the quote I like the most, nobody wants to lift. And the folks that were willing to lift, that worked for those organizations, they're getting too old to lift. So even New Gold, which has a very concerted and successful training program, they have a hard time with retention, and those are not low-paying jobs. Our November unemployment rate just came out last week, and I checked it, so this has been updated since when we did this in October. It went down again, according to Work BC. It's at 3.9%. I think all BC is 4.4%. Usually all the whole Thompson-Nicola region has a higher unemployment rate than Kelowna, but it seemed to have switched. I did reach out to them to question this, but I have not heard back. But we are at our 10-year low now. And there you have the numbers. And looking forward to every year, the province publishes something called the Labor Market Outlook. So they look forward the next decade. And they anticipate in our region of the province, the fastest growing industries will be IT related, trades and public education, travel arrangement services, and machinery manufacturing. And looking at some of these, think back to, I mean, what Ursula highlighted about that demographic loss in the middle. I think this is something that will grow in importance to our region in the next decade. Now, looking at economy, segueing into from employment to income and economy. This is a good news story. Our farm revenues in the Thompson-Okanagan are increasing, and they're increasing faster than the BC norm. And certainly, I mean, if we have a heritage of ranching, which we do, but they're increasing significantly more than the Caribou with whom we share that history of ranching. In terms of straightforward employment income, this looks at only 2 census periods. Like I said, we can go back further, but it would make for such complicated slides. This looks at the increase in median household income in the 2 census periods. And of course, it's a year ahead because it's based on CRA. So if the census is 2021, your income would be based on 2020 numbers. Everybody's moving in the right direction. There's certainly more of a change in certain areas like electoral area J, notably Sun Peaks, L, Barrier. Those are the biggest jumps. There's one missing, and that's not because we forgot, it's because of privacy. They won't publish once you're at a certain scale because a median means less, but also it could compromise confidentiality when you're under 300 people. I'm thinking electoral area B. Yeah, no, it was not an accident. So now looking at where we break down on that income range by category. So in TNRD, median household after-tax income as a distribution. So we're not so much in line with all of BC, we're more in line with Canada. Like you can see BC, the over 150K at the far end. Remember, this is after tax. There's a real spike there compared to Canada or the TNRD. But on the upside, our increase from the last census period was 11.4%, which in Canada it was only 9.8, but BC again was higher at 14.3. And in the census period before this, so 2011 to 2015, we were actually above, we were riding higher than the BC norm. So we've come a little lower. So it does change census to census. And moving on to our next indicator, environment. So our environment indicator focuses on, of all the policy that's in the RGS, what we are looking at is air quality. There is only one, I know that Merritt has a one-year pilot, but the main monitoring station is right in downtown Kamloops on top of the federal building. And so these numbers are from that monitoring station, which these are looking at going back over a decade of the part, this measures the particulate in the air. So what does this measure? It is the mass or weight of particulate, of the smallest particulates, smaller than 2.5 micrometers within a cubic meter of air. So the blue line, you see the blue dashed line at 8, that is the BC target. The target is that we do not want more than 8 micrograms of these really fine particulates. These are the ones you're breathing, not the ones that you're dusting. And they're more likely to be suspended in the air. And you can see our pattern kind of matches where the wildfires are. So the wildfire seasons of 2021, 2017, and 18 are notable. The low one, where we were at the lowest there for a spell, that was low wildfires and less driving with COVID. The peak that we circled there, that's looking out this window in August 1st, 2017, when we were pretty well at the height of the Elephant Hills wildfire. Then that was 2021, again, a peak where we well exceeded the provincial norm. And yes, I'm showing this picture again. This is looking towards Kamloops. On August 16th, so this is mid-afternoon, 3:30 in the afternoon, and the lights are off. So you're looking towards Westwall there, which was frightening. What are these particles and why are they suspended? So here you see microscopic images, and this is care of the BC Lung Association. They publish an annual air report, and you see how small they are compared to an average human hair. And here is why they affect our respiratory health. And because of wildfires, but also it's in the rural areas, especially in the valleys or the municipalities that are in valleys, there's a lot of folks through the winter heating with wood. And if they don't have a high efficiency stove, then you get, especially when there's an inversion, rather than breathing that in through a wildfire, folks are breathing that smoke particulate, the fine particulate through the winter for a longer duration. So according to the ministry, that can actually be more of a concern than those high spike loads during our August wildfire season. Now, my last 2 slides on this indicator look at the scope of the worst days. So this graph here, The BC sets an objective, the BC objective is a maximum of 25 micrograms. So this isn't the average of the 8. So these are the spikes of 25 micrograms over a 24-hour period. So how many days of the year did we exceed this? So again, you see that it was, over a month on those 2 bad wildfire years, but we're doing really well on, or generally well on the other years. But overall, the number of days where we were below, so the worst spikes are getting worse, but the general trend is getting better. So the last slide in green looks at the number of days where we exceeded that provincial average of 8 micrograms, and that slowly has been trending down. I mean, yes, of course, there's some spikes. So with that, I will turn the next indicator, health, back to Ursula.
Correct. So I think the air quality one segues well into the health indicator, but before I get into the stats, I just wanted to show this map here because when we're referring to our health service delivery area, we're talking about the Thompson Caribou Shuswap. That's what the data references, and that includes the TNRD, but it also includes outlying areas as shown on the map there. So Caribou, Chilcotin, 100 Mile House, Lillooet, as well as Salmon Arm and Revelstoke. Health is an indirect indicator of overall progress. So of course we want our region to be healthy, and there's lots of different ways to measure that. Historically, in past reports, we would look at things like standardized mortality and body mass index. Those stats haven't been updated in a while. So with this report, we wanted to look at some metrics that are a little bit different. So for example, we looked more at mental health and some self-reported health behaviors during the pandemic. The first metric we looked at was chronic disease prevalence. This data is from the Chronic Disease Registry from 2020 and 2021. Compared to BC, our health region has a higher prevalence of certain illnesses, including asthma, osteoarthritis, higher rates of COPD or chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, as well as higher rates of substance use disorder and mood and anxiety disorders, which top the charts there at 36%. So because the mood and anxiety disorders were so high, we wanted to look at this one a little further. So this graph here looks at a longer time span over the last 2 decades. So dating back to 2001, 2002, all the way to 2020, 2021. And what we're seeing is a slow, steady increase in the prevalence of mood and anxiety disorders over this time span. And we are at the top. Our health region is above Interior Health, which is shown in orange, and above BC, which is shown in gray. And I also want to mention the mood and anxiety disorders is very clearly defined. It's not just someone going to the doctor and saying, that they feel depressed. The case definition of a mood and anxiety disorder is 1 or more hospitalizations with a mood or anxiety disorder diagnostic code, or 2 or more medical visits with a mood or anxiety diagnostic code within 1 year. Some examples of a diagnostic code are a depressive episode, a bipolar affective disorder, phobic anxiety disorder, and there's a lot of other ones as well. So it is very defined of what that means. Another aspect we looked at with health were risk and protective factors. So these were self-reported health behaviors during the pandemic. So the BC CDC put out 2 rounds of a survey during COVID. This data is from the second round of the survey, which was collected from April till May of 2021. So bearing in mind that it is self-reported, but our region reported higher levels of smoking and a higher prevalence of 1 or more health conditions. and also slightly higher levels of physical activity as compared to BC. As part of this survey, participants were also asked to reflect on their ease of access to healthcare during the pandemic. So what we're seeing here is that we're not special. Our health region is facing much of the same challenges as the province when it comes to accessing healthcare. And what stands out on this graph is the difficulty accessing a family physician. Both our health region and the province noted that the participants in the survey noted more than 75% stated that they had difficulty accessing a family doctor. And as you'll see in the report, there is a quote in there from Ministry of Health data showing that over 50,000 residents in Kamloops and surrounding areas like Sun Peaks and Barrier are unattached to a family doctor. And of course, that's important. It has implications on health overall. So moving on from health into our 8th indicator, which is agriculture. Our RGS goal with agriculture is to support the preservation and increased productivity of agricultural lands, to support local food production and processing facilities, and obviously ensuring food security. What I found interesting in discussing with Regina was that experts at the Ministry of Agriculture a number of years ago had noted that in terms of land and resources, particularly water, the TNRD has the greatest untapped potential for farming. So lots of other areas in our province, like the Fraser Valley and the Okanagan, they're maxed out, so to speak, whereas our region is not. And we've got a tremendous amount of potential when it comes to agriculture. So one of the, or many, there's many of the things that we look at. So there's a lot of information in this graph. We look at things like farmland area, number of farms, hectares irrigated, you know, is it going up, is it going down? So between 2016 and 2021, we've seen a decrease in the number of farms, total farmland area, hectares irrigated, and also a decrease in the total farm operators and employees. On the other side, we've seen an increase in total farm capital, an increase in total operating revenues, and also a higher number of written succession plans. The trend of the increased succession plans is really worth noting because coinciding with the general aging trend, we're also seeing our farm operator ages going up. In Canada, the average age of a farm operator is 56 years old. And in the TNRD, it's a bit higher, 58.6 years old. There was an article put out by the Statistics Canada noting that likely due to challenges during COVID, as well as with the general increasing age of farmers, they did see a large increase in the number of written succession plans, so not just verbal, but written, all across Canada. And we're also seeing that trend in the TNRD. Which is promising. We also wanted to know what is trending in the TNRD. So as staff, we had sort of suspected these trends, but we wanted to reach out to our experts at the Ministry of Agriculture. So the regional agrologists got back to us and they work directly with the farming community. And this is the trends that they noted. So the first is that Lower Mainland dairy operations continue to buy land in the interior for feed production and dry cow pasture, and that's due to cost. The land in the Fraser Valley is much more expensive, so farmers are turning to the interior for cattle ranching. We're also seeing a trend of many new farmers entering the industry in market garden and small scale agriculture with less land or startup requirements. And another trend in the TNRD is we're seeing an increase in grape and fruit growing. And I want to share this particular story about cherries. It's quite a success story. I actually worked on this file last year for 5028 Kamloops Shuswap Road. So on that property, the owner, which is Jealous Fruits, they had applied to site some additional housing there for temporary seasonal workers to help with the cherry harvesting. And last year, the TNRD had its first commercial cherry harvest on over 200 acres on this in this area. Jealous Fruits has they have about 1,200 acres throughout the Thompson-Okanagan, so they're a major industry. And Jealous Fruits distributes their cherries throughout Canada, and they also export them globally, mainly to the US, China, and Hong Kong. So this is very, I thought it was a very interesting success story. So I wanted to share that. So moving on to our 9th indicator, agricultural protection. We measure the selling price of farmland per hectare. This data was compiled by LandCorp. They're a company that tracks all BC land sales, and they sell the data to interested parties like mortgage companies or like the TNRD. The numbers here are based on real estate transactions in our region for Class 9 farm assessed land. So whether it's in the ALR or not. And the summary of this is that parcels that are smaller, so under 8 hectares, are 10 times more costly per hectare to purchase when compared to the larger parcels, which are 8 hectares and over. And lastly, we also like to track our in-house ALR applications. So over the past 2 years, we've had 30 ALR applications in the TNRD, including in municipalities which have ALR land. These 30 applications are ones which have been adjudicated. So they've had a decision made by the Agricultural Land Commission, or they're still active. It doesn't include a number of canceled applications. So we're still seeing the subdivision as the most popular category of application, but that number has gone down. In previous years, that number was closer to 50%, but the last stat we have is it's gone down to about 37%. The second most common ALR application is a NARU, or non-adhering residential use application. That's when someone wants to build a larger residential footprint than they're allowed. So we've also seen that application type go up. In terms of the breakdown, what does this look like? So it's listed there. So of the 11 subdivision applications, 3 were approved, 7 were denied, and 1 is still active. All 8 of the non-adhering residential use applications were approved. For non-farm, 7 were approved, 3 are still active. 2 of the exclusion applications were approved and 1 was denied, and then the 1 inclusion application was approved. And that ties off the agricultural indicators. With this, I'll pass it along to Jamie Vieira to discuss solid waste.
Great, thanks, Ursula. So on the solid waste side, the last indicator, I think clarify up front that this is an indicator in this strategy, but it also, we have, and I mentioned this in our board orientation, a regional solid waste management plan that goes into sort of more detail of how we get to these goals. But what the regional growth strategy goal is to adopt a zero waste philosophy and support the regional solid waste management plan waste reduction goals, which I'll be referring to throughout this. So to start off, as you see here, this is our waste generation per capita. So the blue line is the BC average and NRD is the green. You'll probably hear me say this over and over. I'm very passionate about the fact that this is, in my professional opinion, the best indicator of how we're doing around solid waste is the actual how much waste is going to landfill per person. You may see other reports, and I will refer to it here, about recycling rates, diversion rates, and those are interesting to look at. But at the end of the day, the goal is how much garbage is going in the ground. For example, just because you're recycling more doesn't necessarily mean there's less going into the ground. It might just mean you're buying more stuff that can be recycled, but there still could be an increase in waste generated out of that. So anyways, you can see we're well above the BC average here, which I will clarify is somewhat normal for the interior and northern communities and compared to the South Coast. Oh, and the other thing I wanted to mention here is that solid waste generation per capita is it's a complicated metric when you're trying to figure out why it's there. So these are the numbers that we're at, but it's much more difficult to figure out why they're increasing and decreasing over given years. In general, something to keep in mind is that solid waste generation is a direct correlation with economic activity. So that's one piece. The other piece, especially in a smaller region like ours, less populated region, we see a dramatic increase during times of disaster. So we don't have the 2022 data here, but what I'm expecting, especially in the Merritt area, that we're going to have unprecedented amount of waste that we know went into the landfill following the cleanup of the atmospheric river. So it's important to know what is in our waste. So this is from a report that a study that we commissioned in 2018. And the idea of this is we need to know what's in our waste stream before we can figure out how to reduce waste generation per capita. Now, I will back up a minute, something I forgot to mention. Our goal of the Regional Solid Waste Management Plan, the 10-year plan, is to bring our waste generation per capita down to 500 kilograms per person. So down to what is currently the provincial average. So how are we going to do that? Well, we need to identify where the opportunity is. When you're looking at this graph, think of the black garbage bag going into the landfill. This isn't a measurement of what's going to eco depots and transfer stations and much of it being recycled. This is what actually ends up in the bin that gets buried in the ground. So what's obvious here, and this is similar to other regional districts, is that those organics, compostable organics, is a huge component of that waste stream. And then again, fairly typical plastic and paper products are the next. So you look at that pie and over half of it is in general recyclable or compostable material. So that's where we're going to focus the efforts. So as I mentioned, this is our diversion or amount we've been recycling. So it's broken down both by percentage of the total, how much that percentage that is compared to what goes in the ground. And the top number there is the actual kilograms diverted. Something to note here, and those who have been on this board for a while may remember, in 2016 is when there was a significant change globally that I was up here talking about in the recycling market, which was led by policies directly from China that led to much stricter requirements in terms of what recyclable materials could be exported and the whole mechanism of how they were being recycled. It was called the National Sword policy from China. So that's why over subsequent years you saw a decline in the actual amount of recycling. So yes, we were recycling less, but what was happening there is we were recycling less for the most part because the requirements were stricter. It had to be cleaner, it had to be separated. So those, again, who have been on this board remember that we had to make a major change from the TNRD operations where we had a commingled mixed recycling system to a source separated recycling system. And I'll be the first to admit, yes, that led to less recycling, but it also led to better quality recycling that could actually be properly recycled. But the good news is we see that starting to trend back up in 2020 and 2021. So this kind of goes back to the first slide I showed. How are we doing in the province? Well, we are still fairly far down that list in terms of our waste generation per capita, meaning we are at the higher end of the spectrum when you look at the province. You'll notice this is all broken up by regional districts. So the Ministry of Environment all tracks and reports all their data by regional district. Regional districts are responsible for solid waste management. So as many of you around the table represent municipalities and you have your own operations, all of the data that you see coming from the TNRD, including the city of Kamloops, is built into our TNRD data. So we're kind of all in this together, whether, like the city of Kamloops, they have their own operations and own landfill. All our waste reduction goals under our solid waste management plan are as a region as a whole. So as I mentioned, our goal here is to, over the next 10 years, is to get down to the 500 kilograms per person. And then finally, before I close off, this is sort of just a snapshot at the solid waste committee that will be appointed next in January, I believe. We meet that committee at least twice a year, and we definitely do a deeper dive and kind of geek out into these numbers a little bit more. And that's where we talk about sort of our own internal policies and operations around achieving waste reduction targets, as well as talking about ongoing operational things. I think that's the last slide. Yeah. Turn it back to Regina.
Silence. We are happy to entertain questions on the report, or if you want to take time to look at it and come back, that's, if you don't have a question now, you can reach out later too, but through the chair, if you can.
Thank you very much for that very comprehensive, very interesting presentation. A lot of food for thought in there, I think, for all of us to take back to our areas or our municipalities. Does anyone have any questions for any of the presenters? I've got Director Stamer, Director Sau, Director Houghton to start off with. So we'll start with you, Director Stamer.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks very much for the presentation. Some really good information, Regina. This question is to Jamie. Jamie, when we look at our solid waste reduction numbers down to 499 or 500, when we look at some of what the other regional districts are doing, how realistic is that going to be? Number one, like what's our timeline? And number two, if we factor out all the people in high density, let's use the Lower Mainland as an example, somebody living in a condo that's only got this much room, obviously, they're probably not going to generate the same waste stream as somebody that has a family home and 3 kids. Realistically, is that a target that we're going to be able to achieve? And if not, where would we be, say, 5 years from now in relation to what everybody else is doing?
Thanks. Through the chair. Very good question, Director Stamer. I'm going to go back to, and I think there's a few elements to that question. So the first one is 500 kilograms per person realistic? Short answer I would say is yes. But however, I also agree with you that it's a very different scenario depending on where you live, types of housing, industry, et cetera. So for that reason, we're not looking at some regional districts as a comparison, like some of the small regional districts on Vancouver Island that are already down at like a 350 kilogram per person. There's very little industry in those areas. There's very dense population in those areas. So we're looking at through the solid waste planning process, we came up with this 500 kilograms per hectare as a reasonable, achievable measure. Now, is that reasonable, achievable, or why do we think that? It's back to this question here, or this slide here. 30% of what's currently in our black bags going into the landfill is compostable organics. This was done prior to the city of Kamloops launching their pilot project, and they've since approved, and in 2023 we'll be doing curbside organics citywide. That's going to take a huge chunk out of that pie right there. And following on the heels of that, we're working with, we've been piloting some projects with Sun Peaks, and we'll be working with them also to try get an organics reduction program or organics diversion program happening there as well. Not to say we're not looking at organics diversion in other areas as well, but the urban densely populated areas easiest to capture and collect food scraps from homes. There's also other opportunities in rural areas for dealing with food scraps that urban areas don't have. So that's why those are kind of the low hanging fruit.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair, and thanks, Jamie. And that's what I was leading on, is that I think we want to be, I agree with you, being as proactive as we can with the organics, because there are jurisdictions in BC, like Vancouver, for example, they're not allowed, any organics at all. I think as a group, if we're able to, try to tackle that, that will bring a significant reduction in our total weight per year if we can work towards that. So thanks for that.
Thank you. I have Director Sow next, and then Director Houghton and Director Getz.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Regarding agriculture income, I wonder in the future if we're able to get data on the breakdown on the type of income, like whether or not it's like, fruits and vegetables to cattle sale. Because one of the things I've learned, benefits of carpooling with Director Hayward there, I learned a bit about cattle and the cyclical nature of the cattle sale and the prices and the market and everything, and how sometimes the increase in income actually might not be reflective of the health of the industry. People might be actually getting out. So, we see an increase in numbers of income, but that might not actually be healthy for the industry or the local ranchers. So I wonder if we could, in the future have, more.
Absolutely, we can.
Okay. Yeah.
And, but we wouldn't be generating those numbers ourselves. We'd be at the mercy of either the province or the province would be the Ministry of Agriculture, which is really sporadic with when they come up with what numbers. The census last year, we were very lucky in that the actual federal census did have a spotlight on agriculture across the whole country. So there was like a separate census of agriculture at the same time. We have way more numbers than what we have in this report, but we had to keep it short. So we can look that up for you as well in the meantime.
Thank you, Director Houghton.
Further to Usof's comments there. Your report on agriculture is bang on. Our whole agricultural landscape is changing in the TNRD. I just got out of being in the farm equipment industry for 40 years. And the types of agriculture we're doing now is 100% different than we did back in '82 when I started. The dairy industry is moving up for them from the coast for various reasons, land. Some of the younger generation is moving up into the interior I'll just use the Krause family and the Donaldson family in Barbara's area of Ashcroft. They took over the whole Ashcroft Cache Creek Valley. They turned that whole thing around in a course of a few years. When's the last time I've ever seen potatoes grown at Perry Ranch? Never. Jordan's growing probably 200 acres of potatoes are going to Delta to feed you and I. Moda Dollywall taking over the land at Pritchard at the old Stewart place. How many 100 acres sat idle there for years? Bumper loads of potatoes going to Heffley Creek to the old Houghton farm. What we're losing is our cow-calf person, and that's not just in the TNRD. It's an age thing. The economics of the cow-calf thing is not the greatest. We're losing them. The good river bottom land will keep going to human food and to dairy. Is that a good thing? I think that's probably a good thing. Let the upper lands produce the beef and let the lower lands produce the human food. And on a question for Jamie on the waste disposal, and the operator of the Knutsford transfer station asked me, could we have a bin to put wooden pallets in? He said, I hate to see all these wooden pallets go in the dumpster. Is there a way of, I know you've got eco depots that put other things in, which I think are great, but at these smaller transfer station, is there the capacity to maybe add a few things, or is that just what goes to Recycle BC?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Director Houghton, through the chair. I'll pass that along to our staff. The general answer is, our level of service and different diversion areas at transfer stations like in Knutsford is not as extensive as at Eco Depot. So we try steer those larger loads of, like, for example, wood waste to the Eco Depots where we have enough room to separate it and to grind it to recover it. I'll have to look into sort of the details of the Knutsford one of whether that's, yeah, but it's a fair comment, and it's we strive to sort of provide the best services we can within the confines of that property and with depending on the population size and that sort of thing in the area.
Thank you. I have Director Getz.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a question with the housing, actually a two-pronged question, housing and solid waste. We track the number of homes started. Do we now track, or are we going to have an asterisk beside this for like the area of merit where by the time we're done all of this with modular homes, apartments and homes, we've lost probably close to 100 homes. And some of the homes that are still standing, the only thing that won't be touched on these homes is the shingles. They're basically destroyed inside. There's no floors, no walls, no ceilings. And if anybody's ever been in a flood, even though you take the first 4 feet of your drywall out, everything wicks to the ceiling and the home is completely destroyed. So basically these homes are standing, but they're shells, and they will pretty much be considered new construction at some point in time. So I'm just wondering if we do follow that at all. And then my other question to Jamie is, the last time I was up at the Eco Depot, because I'm weird that way, they told me we were close to 200,000 tons of items that had come out of people's homes. And probably about 20,000 tons of that was from my basement. But anyway, and I'm just wondering, will we see a different kind of report on how that's all handled? Because another thing, if you haven't been in a flood, everything was looped into one giant pile of everything, mud, disposables, and anybody that had a home done before, I think 1990 or 95 was using asbestos-based drywall, so that's all in there. And then the alluvial soil that packed up, I think we were close to 200 tons or 300 tons of it. And I was just wondering if the TNRD had done anything. We had a huge pile out there, and I was just wondering if where it went or what happens with that kind of soil, because a lot of that soil was contaminated waste with sewer backup. So I'll thank you for the answers.
Go first. So I'll just go quickly. So first, these numbers do not include replacements. So if it's a building permit for a house that was lost in one of the wildfires, that's not a new house. That's a replacement, just like a reno isn't a new house, or if people are expanding their house. If they're adding a unit, a suite to the basement, and they're actually getting a building permit, which is really good, then that's a new housing unit. Does that answer you? Okay.
And regarding the question around where the waste from the flood debris ended up, the short answer is, by and large, most of it went direct to landfill. There was no ability to separate it again because of hazards and contaminants. So that's why when we'll be reporting out on our 2022 waste generation, that there's going to be a big spike in the Merritt landfill. And I'm not saying that was, we really operationally, that's the only option, and that's what we want to save landfill spaces for. What we always say is we want to maintain our landfill space for what it actually needs to go to the landfill. So things that don't need to go there are what we're trying to divert and maintain the space for what needs to go there.
Thank you, Director Morris.
Thank you, Chair. Through the chair to Jamie. The question is around air quality, actually, by Valley corridor. So I was looking at the data, and what we see, of course, is the impact of the peak fire years, absolutely, in terms of air quality. But there's an underlying, in one of the Valley corridors in my area, that there's probably an increasing incidence of poor air quality. Do we get data, recent data on those corridors? Are we able to break that down further and net out fire impacts as an example?
I'll actually put that over to Regina because
Okay.
she did their quality side. But
So no, we do not. there's only so many of the full monitoring stations that run 24/7. And the only one that has that longevity of data is on the Kamloops Federal Building. That said, we can ask, I know that the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change, I think it's called now, they do have staff here in the Kamloops office that focus on air quality. And they, they have stations where they'll monitor something on location. I know they have a pilot, a 1-year pilot in Merritt with a full station, I believe. So we can ask them. And I know that in terms of the sort of the slow and steady impact of wood burning stoves, we had a program, Herb, in Lower Nicola for a stove exchange program. I believe Merritt has one now. So rather than, I mean, a lot of places like Lower Mainland, you're just not allowed a wood burning stove. The older ones are grandfathered, but if you can't put in a new one, I know that's been discussed in some municipalities, but in the TNRD at this board table, to my knowledge, it has never been discussed. But I know we have had a wood burning stove exchange program. We don't now.
Okay, well, first of all, I saw.
I just want to add something to that if I could, Madam Chair, just if I can add, sorry for jumping out of tune, but I think the feds are coming out with a new regulation in 2026, because I know some of our municipalities will have the same issues, particularly like in Barrier with inefficient wood burning. And I believe we can check into it, but I'm pretty sure that in 2026, there's new federal regulations that are going to be coming into effect that we can actually go back, and some of these ones that are grandfathered, we can actually start applying some of the new rules. So sorry for that, but I think there's some stuff coming down to help us. Thanks.
Mr. Vieira.
Thank you, Chair. Just to add to Regina's comments, around the wood burning stove exchange and air quality programs. Some people may be aware that other regional districts have a more sort of, what's the word? They actually have an air quality mandate and a program to do their own monitoring and to promote things like reduced or improving air quality. So that's, I guess, back to what Regina was talking about with the wood stove exchange program. We have not been, TNRD board hasn't given those kind of that direction, provided resources to focus on that. So what this report is just kind of focusing in on reporting out the state of air quality. But at this point, we don't have any program in place as the regional district to take steps to try improve air quality. Some regional districts have made the decision to, for example, create departments and staffing to do that. I just wanted to clarify that.
Thank you. Do you have a supplemental, Director Morris?
No, just to comment that it's, the question was posed around a broader sense of air quality, for example, industrial as well, not specific to the wood burning stoves. Thank you.
Okay, Director Laird.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We had an in-depth report, I think it was at one of our committee of the whole meetings on wood burning devices. It was quite informative. And at the time, there was no interest in the TNRD taking up any sort of wood exchange programs. The one that was run in Merritt and Lower Nicola, they felt that they'd pretty well removed all of the old wood burning appliances, and most people had taken advantage and put in a new one. And I'm not sure if that's true in all parts of the regional district, but I think there is a report that came to the board if we want to review that and have a look at it and see if we want to change, because they spent quite a bit of time looking at putting that sort of a program in. It's just it's all there if we want to review it again.
Thank you, Director. I was going to mention there was a report done, and it would have given the member municipalities, from what I recall, an opportunity to opt in to an extent, because many municipalities, especially small ones, find it a bit of an onerous program to administer on their own, but the opportunity was there to come under the broader umbrella of the TNRD as a whole. But as Director Laird said, there just wasn't a broad enough support for it throughout the TNRD as a whole. So with a new board, it might be a time to review that once more and see if there is an appetite with the new board to enter into something like that. Does anyone else have any comments or questions? Okay, I've got Director Houghton again and then Director Grenier.
This is Jamie, through the chair. We've mentioned wood burning appliances. Back at home, I have a wood pellet heater. Is wood pellet heaters lumped in with large wood, or are they considered a different source of emissions and regulations?
Yeah, through the chair, it is considered wood burning, but I think maybe for this discussion, I'll provide a very brief context or background of how the provincial program works. So it is provincially funded. It's called the Wood Stove Exchange Program, and the idea is it's a rebate program that incentivizes people to remove and replace old, inefficient wood burning stoves. So there, for example, there's a rebate that if you remove an old wood burning stove and replace with even a wood burning pellet stove, that pellet stoves are much more efficient, that you can have a rebate and lower your cost of installing that. So that's the way the provincial program works. The catch with the provincial program is there's annual funding allocated, but they don't have the resources provincially to administer the program. So local governments need to provide the resources, the staffing to actually review the applications, issue the rebates, process the applications in order for residents to participate in that. So every year we get a handful of calls from frustrated individuals who hear that this rebate is available in a neighboring regional district or municipality, but within the TNRD, it's not available because we don't have staff allocated to administer that program. And that is the report that Director Laird was referring to.
And Director Grenier.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess I've got some questions of our Chief Planning Officer, Regina. And I thank you for the report, and I find it very interesting, the data and the different the analysis is one analysis. I look at the data, I see different analysis, but that goes with the territory. I live in an area that is and moved to British Columbia to an area that was in the fringe area policy of the city of Kamloops. I don't know how many of the directors know about a fringe area policy, but I encountered it in 1994. It's still there. I'm not even sure why it's still there, and I'm not sure whether it's still relevant today. The fringe area policy is an area that captures my area J, I believe, Doug's area L, and Lee's area P. It's an outlying area of the city of Kamloops, and somebody some time ago thought, well, we better control what's going on in the regional areas. Randy Deal told me it was so that people didn't move to the rural areas because it was cheaper than building a house in the city of Kamloops. There was sort of fundamental concern about that. I wonder if you could comment on the fringe area policy, and then I would also like to comment on some of the things that I observe that is somewhat different as a person from the real estate development background. I'd like to just give you some other views of the data that I see.
So yes, the fringe area policy is still in effect and has been since the early 80s. It was updated and reviewed and modified somewhat when the RGS was amended from 2011 to 2013-ish. It's not just residential, and it's not just Kamloops. So if we get an application to, like we are in the throes of one now, to rezone land to industrial just outside the city boundary, we send a referral to that subject municipality. And I mean, the sort of radius, it's mapped for all the municipalities. You can take a look at that. Merritt and Kamloops being bigger, it's a bigger radius. And I'd say we get them more often for other uses than residential. Like I said, industrial is one, because land in the rural areas tends to be less expensive than the municipalities. That does not bind the board when considering an application in the fringe area, but it does bind the staff for a clear referral to that municipality. And we usually recommend whatever that municipality has to say, not always, but almost always. And I'll use an example. There was a residential example south of Chase. There was a rezoning subdivision of a kind of swath of small acreages. That referral went to the village of Chase. They supported it. We supported it. It was rezoned and subdivided, and they're there now. So I think it's again, it doesn't bind the board to a decision. I think it's just good planning to have it in place. So that's.
Thank you for that. When I got here in 94 and was contemplating what is now Tobiano, and I sat down with Randy Deal, who was the chief administrative officer for the city of Kamloops. We're talking about this fringe area policy. He explained to me at that time that the reason it was there was because they saw River Shore develop as a subdivision outside of the city of Kamloops. Their concern was that the people that were living outside of the city of Kamloops weren't participating in the costs of things like the tournament capital buildings and some of the other social programs. And they said, we're not collecting the taxes in that area. People are having the benefit of living just outside of the city boundary, paying less taxes, and they're not paying development cost charges. So I said, okay, how do we resolve that? I can't move the lake, which is the reason I was there, Kamloops Lake, lifestyle. It happened to be there. It happened to be on the Trans-Canada Highway. There was a whole bunch of boxes that it ticked off. Randy, how do we handle that? And he says, well, development cost charges in the city of Kamloops back then, this conversation was about 2000. Development cost charges for a single family lot were $56.25. $5,625 is what a developer had to pay the city of Kamloops for these future parks and what have you. I said, that's great. We'll make what we call a hookup fee, because we can't charge a development cost charge, but a hookup fee to the water. We'll make ours $7,500. That way you can't say that people are moving to Tobiano because it's cheaper to move to Tobiano. So that's great. All right, well, what are the development cost charges today in the city of Kamloops? Is there a city Kamloops councilor that can answer that? I think it's upwards around $25,000. $56.25 to $25,000. Development cost charges, I know it, or hookup fee at Tobiano, $7,500. That increase is distorting why people want to move where they want to move. Yes, they want to move to the rural areas because it's cheaper. Yes, because development cost charges have gone up. But we heard yesterday almost $100 million of budgets that we've got to contend with and got to pay for. In the city of Kamloops, they've got development cost charges. What are we doing in terms of subdivision in the fringe area policy? Are we looking at parks and rec? Are we looking at water? We're inheriting water systems that are failing. The communities are there saying, please take over my water, but we don't have development cost charges to pay for that. I heard the mayor of Clearwater talk about, we don't want 5% park anymore. We got enough park. We want 5% in lieu. We want the cash so that we can build different services. That was a comment a few other days ago. I think as the TNRD, we have to have a refreshing look at this and say, okay, we are in the fringe area of the city of I am. Some of the others are in, maybe a fringe area of Clearwater or Cache Creek, but maybe we ought to get ahead of this pressure of development and entertain things like development cost charges, latecomer fees, 5% in lieu so that we can get ahead of parks, get ahead of some of these things. And I would welcome a working committee just from a new perspective on this regional growth strategy, just to see if we're still relevant. Thank you.
Thank you. And I had Director Newstadter.
Thanks, through the chair to staff. Just curious, as we look at that comparable slide with the communities, I'm not sure I understood the why behind it. Why are we so far down that list compared to other communities, and what's the simplest step? I understand we're with the waste change with the city of Kamloops, they'll change things a little bit. But just wondering how we fell so far down that list.
Thanks for the question. Through the chair, I guess we didn't fall down that list. We've been down at that list for a while. So we haven't moved up the list is really the way I would look at it. So yeah, we've been, and you can see geographically when you look at those other ones, it seems to be you start at the north of the map, and that's who's at the bottom of the list, and you work your way down. But not to say that's an excuse, but that's kind of the trend. So we've always been there, and we're going to try to work our way up.
Thank you. So it's not so much that we fell, we've just never risen. Okay.
I guess to add why are we there? So generally speaking, rural areas, more industrial areas have more waste generation per capita. Remember, this isn't directly a reflection of how much recycling, this is how much waste is being generated. So economic activity, industrial activity, all that is factored into how much waste ends up in landfills. So again, it's not just geographic, the fact that you're in the north, that you have a higher amount of garbage going to landfill. It's the industries up there produce more waste.
Director Sal?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Related to that topic about compostable waste, just sharing a comment from the community area A. People have mentioned that the TNRD, I think earlier this year, had like free composting bins and such, but the problem that we face in rural areas is bear attractants, so they were not allowed to do that in the backyard. So yeah, just something to consider for rural areas for compostable waste.
Thank you. I'm not seeing any more hands, so we do have a couple of recommendations here. And this means that if we adopt these recommendations, it will be coming back to us in the spring of 2023. So what is the board?
So moved.
Thank you, Director Stamer, second.
Second.
Saw Director Getz. Director Rain?
I did point out, I think in the population numbers, like Sun Peaks, in the census, we're 1,400, and here we're showing 900. I realize that this is being printed already, but in the electronic version going forth, can we make a correction there?
We will check the numbers and recognize that the BC stats are different than the census for population, but we will check them, Director Rain, before we publish. So basically, we can certainly check the numbers, but the numbers are the numbers. We ask for the board to accept it, and then we send it on to the province. We put it on our website. We share it with our municipalities. So that's not really a formal, it's an informal process. Yes.
You may have noticed yesterday in the health meeting, Sun Peaks doesn't exist. No.
I missed that meeting, so you exist for me.
So we do have the recommendation, and that is, I believe, both parts, Ms. Campbell. They are combined. So we have a recommendation on the floor. Are there any more comments or questions? On the question then, all those in favor? Any opposed? Seeing none, that is carried. CEO Hildebrand?
Thank you, Chair Roden. I just would maybe suggest that a real short break might be in order. We need about 30 to 40 minutes for the next presentation is all we have. And we kind of pushed the pizza lunch up to 11:30 to kind of make it work better for everybody. So if the board wishes so, that would be,
Short break?
yeah. if
All
that's
right,
fine with the board.
there is fresh coffee. All right, well, thank you very much. We now move on to emergency program update from Kevin Skrepnik, our manager of community and emergency services, and Mike Nauf, emergency program coordinator. Take it away, gentlemen.
Right.
And you are neither of those
I'm neither
people,
of
so.
I just wanted to give a quick introduction to this presentation. So I probably covered this in about 2.5 minutes during the board orientation. I know there's a lot of interest in this. So the real experts who know this program inside and out are here presenting. So yeah, Kevin Skrepnik is our manager of community and emergency services. He's fairly new to that role. He was our emergency program coordinator for a number of years before that. And he's got an extensive background as well with BC Wildfire. And so when Kevin moved into that new role, we brought in Mike Knopf, who's very experienced in this world as well. He's been with the province up until this point in the emergency management program there. So I'll pass it over to these guys to walk you through our role. The intent of this is to discuss and give you a better sense of what our role as a regional district is in responding to emergencies and how our program works.
All right, good morning, everybody. So yeah, as Jamie mentioned, my name is Kevin Skrepnik. I've had the opportunity to meet a number of you already, but obviously a lot of new faces on the board. And yeah, we wanted to take this opportunity. I know Jamie had some one-on-one meetings, particularly with some of the electoral area directors, but we wanted to take some time to kind of delve into this a little bit more. Obviously, whatever we can do ahead of time when it comes to emergency management and emergency response in terms of kind of building everyone's understanding, it's tends to streamline things once we're into it. So we'll have just some introductions to the overall team in the Community and Emergency Services Department. A quick overview in terms of the structure we have here in TNRD, and also the structure provincially, which we're very much integrated with. And you know what the engagement is going to look like between the board and staff once we're into an emergency event. We're going to walk through a few just kind of broad scenarios of the kind of incidents that we typically run into. Obviously, it can be any number of things, but we've kind of flagged wildfire, flooding, and hazardous material incidents as being the ones that we often encounter in this area. And then we'll walk through some of the priorities for the program going forward over the next year or so. And then some time for Q&A. Very aware acutely of the fact it's been a long 2 days on the heels of a long 2 months for you folks, and it's been quite a download of information, and we obviously don't want to be the one standing between you and pizza, so we'll try to be as concise as possible. Yeah. So the Community and Emergency Services team is part of Jamie's overall operations division. This is a new department in its current composition. It's gone through a few iterations over the past few years. Kind of the biggest development is we have moved the fire protection service over here. So under Jason Tomlin is now its own department. That used to be part of the overall community services portfolio. So myself, as Jamie mentioned, I'm quite new to the role, just in the last few months moved into the manager position. We do have Sherry Madden and Joe Kang, who are our community service coordinators. I'm sure a number of our EA directors have probably already had an opportunity to work with Sherry and Joe. That community services portfolio is quite a kind of a grab bag of a number of the services that we offer that aren't big enough for their kind of own standalone departments. So things like parks, cemeteries, river buoys, certain street light operations, things like that fall into that community services model. In some electoral areas, economic development, tourism, marketing, things like that. Also in the CES department is our invasive plant program, which is a whole operation in of itself. One of the kind of oldest services TNRD operates. Colleen Hogan is the coordinator there and does a fantastic job. That's a very busy program in and of itself in the invasives world. She has one seasonal staff, and then they bring in summer staff as well. And that's an area where I'm sure we'll be touching base on in the future as well. But in terms of the emergency side of things, so we, as Jamie mentioned, so Mike Knopf just came on board with us in the last few months here after, a decade plus with Emergency Management BC. we're really delighted to have Mike on board. Our EOC, and we'll kind of get into what our activities have been like over the past few years. But as you can imagine, obviously we've got a lot of experience under our belt between 2017 and of course the multiple events last year with wildfire and flooding. So I would say in terms of other regional districts and other local government operations in the province, we already had foundationally probably one of the strongest structures in the province. Bringing in Mike with just the subject matter expertise of the provincial structure and the legislation and the policy. I'll be candid. Mike was probably at EMBC one of the most senior and kind of well-versed folks the province had in that realm. So to bring him into this operation is quite exciting, and I think it's going to let us make some real leaps and bounds progress here. We've also brought in Michelle Kozashar, who's she also started in November. She's going to be our administrative assistant for the department, supporting all of the functions, but certainly will be active in the emergency realm as well. And then I'll turn it over to Mike there.
Thanks, Kevin, and thanks for those kind words. So yes, Mike Knopf, previously with Emergency Management BC, and now I actually am here to help. So just a few bullets about emergency management in the TNRD and BC. Really, the biggest key is the emergency powers. You've all heard, I'm sure, of states of local emergency, evacuation orders. There's 9 extraordinary powers that are granted to local governments when they declare a state of local emergency. Really key, and misconception, because people watch a lot of American television. States of local emergency do not enable funding. They do not draw attention to the event. They're there very specifically for those emergency powers. So we function as an emergency program without a state of local emergency. It's really when we need to evacuate people or enact some of the special powers that we need that state of local emergency. And really it is those evacuations and orders that are really key from a public safety perspective. We act on the recommendation from a subject matter expert. So we wait for BC wildfire in the case of fire to tell us that we need to move people, and we engage on those recommendations. We do generally not have the subject matter expertise in-house to make those determinations at the time. So we look at either, professional engineers or, some of the skilled staff from a ministry to give us that professional advice. Really, we're focused on getting people out of the way and safe and accommodated. That is the #1 priority. So that's what the EOC here will be focusing on is, and the acronym is ESS. And I'm sorry if I throw acronyms in, somebody hit me with a pencil or something, but we're really bad for acronyms in the emergency management world. But ESS is really, one of the big keys, and looking after the people who are being impacted by events. And of course, we work very closely with the province. Emergency Management BC is one of our big partners, and they are one of the principal funding streams we have. So items need to be approved by them for reimbursement. We don't have a lot of money to spend on anything outside of what's been approved by the government. So we work very closely with them on an approval process, and there's some really good processes and procedures in place to support that. Oh, other way. It's the biggest button. That's a clue, I think. So yes, getting people out of harm's way and supporting them until they can get home. And recovery is a whole nother problem to be dealt with.
And again, Mike talked about our deep affection for acronyms. So you might hear once we're into an event, the EAFs, we're waiting on an EAF, things like that. So that's an expense authorization form. Yeah. So basically what that is when we're in the course of responding, because the lion's share of what money is going to be spent will eventually be reimbursed from the province. An EAF is a form we submit to say, here's the issue, here's what we need to spend to deal with it. And we receive a fairly prompt response from the province one way or the other in terms of whether that's going to be approved or not. So there are financial guidelines around what we can do and what we can't do. And generally there's some things that can be done kind of within those overall guidelines. But generally, if we're going to be spending any kind of notable amount of money, we're going to have an EAF approved ahead of time before we go ahead with that. So an example could be if we need to order sandbags, if we need to engage a professional geotech, hydrologist, things like that, we would submit an EAF to the province saying, this is what we need to do, this is what we need to spend. We get that approval, and then that's sort of what empowers us to go on from there. In terms of in the TNRD, so we've used that term EOC, so an emergency operations center. So we'll get into kind of what the overall structure is provincially, but that is basically the emergency response mechanism, the emergency management mechanism that we activate here at TNRD. And that's similar for other local governments and First Nations as well. Now, a real key thing to remember is the staff that are in that EOC, we have mechanisms to bring in contractors and folks from other agencies to assist, but the vast majority of them are TNRD staff. So these are people who are then going to have to set aside the day work to come in here and work on the emergency response. And that's not an insignificant thing. So in 2021, just for the fire season, we were activated for more than 70 days in here. So that was 70 days that a lot of work wasn't happening in other departments. And also, justifiably, there's a lot of recognition for the folks who come into the EOC, and it's long hours and stressful work. But also, I think we need to keep in mind the impacts we have on the rest of the organization, who are having to kind of keep the wheels on the bus and make sure that our day-to-day responsibilities as a government are still being met, right? So when we have events like what we saw last year, it's incredibly consequential for the organization. Our finance staff, the burden it puts on them in terms of the millions of dollars that we have to spend. Again, it is all, for the most part, reimbursed from the province, but it's quite a process in terms of going through that. And we have to shoulder that kind of debt for the initial until we can be reimbursed. So as I mentioned last year, 70 days plus for the wildfire event. And then of course, the atmospheric river again in November, we had to activate for. We work in a structure called the Incident Command System, or ICS. So when you come into a room and you see folks in these different kind of color-coded vests, you'll hear terms like incident commander, information officer, section chief, things like that. This all comes from the Incident Command System. It's fairly universal in the Western world. It's used in Australia, New Zealand, the United States. Many areas use it. It's becoming mandated more and more also for public and private sector to adopt this. The idea being that it's a standardized structure for emergency response that everyone uses. So, I'll use an example for BC wildfire. They can bring in someone who's trained as a planning section chief from New Zealand. They can come to BC, and ostensibly their roles and responsibilities and duties and even the forms they use are going to be the same. So you've got this level of interoperability. We do quite a bit of work just as a regional district and one of our size. We're fond of making the point, we're larger than Switzerland. We're larger than a lot of European countries. And we have one full-time staff dedicated to emergency management, right? So it is a challenge from that perspective, and we do have to lean on other agencies and other staff to kind of come in and support. When we're working with other jurisdictions too, again, just because of the geography of the TNRD, within our boundaries and our core jurisdiction, we have municipalities, we have dozens of First Nations as well. So there's a lot of coordination that has to happen there. So in 2021, if you would often see, obviously, the fires and floods really paid no heed to our administrative boundaries. So it was going to be impacting multiple governments at the same time. So we would be working with First Nations, a recommendation would come in, say, to lift an evacuation order. We would ensure that we were doing that in lockstep with a neighboring First Nation or municipality, just to make sure that things were happening at the same time and trying to avoid the confusion on the ground there. Obviously, that's particularly complicated for us because we're sort of the umbrella jurisdiction that's sitting over everybody else. So not every year is the same, thankfully. So certainly 2021 was absolutely devastating for many corners of this regional district. 300 plus evacuation orders and alerts. 293 of those were just from the wildfire season alone. And then into last year, where we're thankfully, or this year, I should say, where we only had 3. So that part and parcel of this industry is that we never know what we're going to be heading into, as we kind of go into our hazard season generally of freshet and wildfire. Certainly 2022, all the ingredients were there, and we did have some fires, Nahameen Creek across from Lytton, as well as the Watching Creek fire just northwest of town here, as well as a number of other small ones. But thankfully, just with the weather patterns we had and the response that was in place, none of them became major concerns beyond that. In the entire province in 2021, I think something about 80% of all of the evacuation orders came out of this room, just given how many fires we had on the go at the same time. All right.
So it's important to understand what we can and cannot do. And we don't have authority for a lot of the things that are emergency events. Big list here, fighting wildfire. We don't fight fire. Some of the TNRD fire departments will certainly be engaged. BC Wildfire does a pre-org and puts them on the list, and they'll respond. But they respond for BC Wildfire, and they work with BC Wildfire, and that's where the line of communication goes. We do. If we're asked to support, we're certainly there. And every one of these bullets has items that bleeds over that needs an EOC to engage and support the community. But we're not directly responsible for the causal incident. Waterways, we're impacted by flooding all the time, but the province actually owns the water. And they have the mandate to control what happens in and about a stream. So we need to work with the province in flooding situations so that we're, on the right side of the law and we're still supporting the residents. Really good work with water management. They're really good to work with in flood season, and they recognize that public safety takes a priority to most other things. But they're still the lead agency for water related items. Roadways, well, really there's 3 options for roads. It's either owned by the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure, it's owned by the Forest Service or one of their licensees, or in many cases, residents own their own roads. Or, in a lot of cases, the road they're using isn't actually a road. It's a pathway through the forest that they call a road. But we don't own those roads. And the owners of those roads are ultimately responsible for fixing the problems with those roads. So in a large landslide, the road is the issue. That's what's causing, it's an egress issue. We'll support the communities that are cut off with, essential supplies and things like that, but we don't get to directly fix the road. That falls to the agency who owns it. Ministry of Environment, they're key, and we'll talk a little bit about hazardous spills here in a little bit. Water and septic systems, unless it's one of the services the TNRD is providing. If you the water the Drinking Water Act actually says that a purveyor is responsible for their own emergency plan. So if you are your own water purveyor, You own your water, you own the responsibility for making sure that you get water if something bad happens to your source. And this is, you know, I mean, water boxes and wells throughout the region everywhere. Policing, we don't have a police force. We count exclusively on the RCMP or some First Nation police forces throughout the region to provide enforcement. Work very closely with them, particularly when we're doing evacuations. The police of jurisdiction is the lead agency. We support them in doing that, you know, and search and rescue is another resource that comes into play. Lots of resources support the police, but they are the lead. And we're in a supporting role. And health services. Certainly, this is a changing bullet because, well, of COVID. Pandemics never used to be within inside of the emergency management envelope. That may be changing, and certainly EOCs throughout the province were supporting the population during COVID with some essential PPE and things while other systems were engaged. And we saw the province bring in a provincial deck to control supply chains and things like that. So there isn't an emergency management play, but really the lead is our health authorities, Interior Health, First Nations Health Authority lead when we're dealing with health services issues.
And I'll add, so you can imagine with that list being what it is, we have to do a lot of expectation management because a lot of the public, and to be candid, a lot of our colleagues with the province conflate us with a municipality. Which would have the responsibility for many of those things, whereas we as a regional district don't. And I think part of that, I mean, regional districts are a fairly unique creature to British Columbia. Most other provinces operate on a county system. So our level, we kind of live in that gray area, and there is, unfortunately, you know, we'll see often from the province when policies are coming out, they're much more geared towards municipal emergency management as opposed to ours, which is very, very different in terms of what we're capable of doing.
So these couple diagrams on the page here, this Kevin talked about the incident command system, the org chart there that has the EOC management and as the director. So those are the colors you'll see if you're looking at an EOC. A really great system. It's trained to by virtually every organization involved in emergency management in BC. It allows us to all speak the same language and understand what roles and responsibilities are. It allows us to plug and play people within a jurisdiction. I can put a request into the province and say, geez, we need some people in operations. And that allows them to qualify people and send us a resource that understands how to fulfill the obligations and duties of that role. Very broadly, the top is our command team, director, deputy director, a risk management officer, a liaison, and information officers. Down below, they're section chiefs. Very broadly, operations is, you know, the doers. The planning group are our thinkers. Logistics are our getters, and the finance group are the payers. Never underestimate the importance of finance group. They should be the first in and the last out, because this is not a cheap endeavor. Emergency management is expensive. So, you know, it's really important that we put our systems in place so that we can appropriately track the issues and the costs and, you know, get the money back and not leave it on the end of the table. The diagram on the right, and, you know, excuse the fine print, but that's really the provincial structure and what systems and organizations engage when a local emergency operations center activates. The biggest key for this slide, and the one important thing to recognize, is if you follow the line straight up from the bottom, you end up in the Premier's office. So there is a direct line of reporting to the top of the government when we activate our EOCs. we have everyone's attention, which also means we also have everyone's eyes. They're looking on what's going on, and we have government's attention. But as a bonus, we have the ability to escalate issues up through the political chain to resolve issues that are not resolvable through normal processes and procedures. So that's the big key on that slide, is it is an all of government response. The one thing I didn't mention on the other slide with the ICS EOC group, at the very top, you'll see the policy group. Elected officials are the policy group. There is an interface there between the EOC and the policy group, and Kevin will talk to that in a little bit. That's a two-way path of communication, because the one thing that is not on that slide are the residents. And you know where they're reaching in. They're reaching in everywhere they can, because generally speaking, they're experiencing some of the worst days of their lives. So they're looking for support, and the phone will be ringing. So you can expect that residents will reach in with issues and concerns. And there is a pathway to bring those into the organization so that they're recognized by the Emergency Operations Center and we can effectively deal with them.
And I'll maybe just kind of illustrate where sometimes this can be a bit of a circuitous process. So I'll use an example of, if we're in a flooding event and we are hoping to tap into, say, a local BC wildfire crew to assist with sandbagging or something like that. Because of the nature of this structure, there's unfortunately a lot of steps involved and a lot of points of failure. Where we are essentially, so we're kind of at the EOC here. We would put a request into the PREOC, which is the Provincial Regional Emergency Operations Center. So we have one of those based in Kamloops here, the Central Region PREOC. They would take that request. It would go up to the PECC, which is the Provincial Emergency Coordination Center based out of Sampston. They would pass it over to BC Wildfires headquarters, which would then go down to a regional coordination center and then down to the actual site level. Then that has to come all the way back up, all the way back to us to actually tell us where they're coming and when we should expect them. So unfortunately, as you can imagine, there's points of failure there where sometimes we've requested crews, haven't really heard back about what's happening, and then next thing we know, they're out there with no supervision and no marching orders because there's been a breakdown. So just when we're in situations like that, and sometimes it feels like things are really kind of navigating the gears, this is kind of how the hot dog gets made. So as Mike had alluded to, in terms of how we're going to be engaging with the board here, and certainly Scott, Deanna, and Jamie, if they want to jump in here at all with some of our past experiences from last year. So in terms of authority, the chair or the vice chair or a designate is going to be the one responsible for signing the declaration of a state of local emergency. So Mike had mentioned those 9 powers. We won't inventory all of them, but really the most important one is the power for us to implement an evacuation order. We can do an evacuation alert without a state of local emergency. An alert basically being, we're putting people on notice that there's a potential, but the order is the actual order that it is mandatory at that point. Some agencies are empowered to institute what's called a tactical evacuation. So RCMP, fire services, BC Wildfire. If they're on the ground and they see an imminent threat to public safety, they can order people to leave their homes as well without a state of local emergency. But generally, this is the way it would happen. Now, when that is signed, as part of that paperwork, there is also a delegation of authority at that point that then empowers the EOC director and the EOC staff to do what they need to do from that point on. So once the state of local emergency is signed, the EOC director at that point can start signing off on the evacuation orders and, start allocating resources and making decisions around what's going to happen from that point on. Now, if this emergency is in an area that you represent, you're going to be notified by us. It's generally going to be from senior staff, so Scott, Deanna, Jamie, potentially myself, as opposed to the staff in the EOC, because they're going to be quite operationally focused. So if, generally is once we hear something's going on, the phone call to the local mayor or electoral area director is one of the first things that happens. We want you to be informed, and often you're also going to be an important source of information for us in terms of what's actually happening out here. Again, with the size of TNRD, we often, unfortunately, our situational awareness can sometimes be quite limited when we're in this room and there's an event happening in Blue River or Lytton or Clinton, et cetera. If we're into an ongoing emergency, so if we're in a 2021 scenario where it is going on for months on end, generally there'll be a regular, potentially daily update coming out to the board. There's going to be information in there that might not necessarily, it wouldn't be confidential, but the stuff that we're kind of getting internally from the response agency is a lot more detailed than what's necessarily going to be going out to the public. And as I said, kind of as those local elected officials, you're going to be a really important conduit in terms of information to the residents that are impacted, and for us to also get those voices back in. So, there's not going to be an operational component within the EOC for the elected officials, but you're going to be a part of the process, as Mike showed there, in terms of that policy group box off to the side that's kind of informing what's happening in the EOC. Scott, yeah.
Thanks, Kevin. If I could just share a quick example that's just etched in my memory from 2021, when we were basically in an EOC situation for 76 or 78 days. It was pretty a live response where we had multiple fires everywhere. But in that situation and the situations going forward, when I have experts like Mike and Kevin in the room, typically in small communities, the CAO is typically the director of the EOC, and that's not how we did things here. Jamie, Kevin, and now Mike would be those directors. I took the role of a liaison. So as things came through, I would be the ones, responsible for reaching out to the elected officials, to the chair, to the vice chair, and providing updates on a regular basis, sometimes daily, to the entire board. I just felt like these are the experts that you want as directors of the EOC, and I was kind of a support role. And then to ensure that we have kind of fresh eyes and fresh blood going through here. You can't be in here 76 days in a row. So that's where I would lean on Deanna or Jamie or others to kind of fill in for me to make sure we have a bit of work-life balance, because some of those days were, they were 16 or 18-hour days and it was every day. So just an experience from 2021. It was pretty intense, but we did a pretty good job, I thought. So thanks, Kevin.
And there is obviously, with the local government elections having just occurred, the province is organizing training opportunities for elected officials to get kind of more orientation on this. We're kind of working on the coordination of that still. We're hoping that they can offer up an online opportunity for that. A bit of a struggle, again, to dovetailing on a previous point, is that a lot of it is geared towards municipal elected officials. So we wanted to make sure there's one that's going to not muddy the waters in terms of what we can do and what we can't do. So we're just going to walk through a few quick kind of hazard specific scenarios here in terms of what the process of a response might look like. So with wildfire, as was mentioned before, the wildfire service is the lead agency. They're going to be the subject matter experts. They're going to be the ones actually fighting to and managing the fire. And they're going to be providing awareness to the other agencies in government as well as ourselves in terms of what's happening on the ground and what we need to do to support. So that could involve evacuation alerts and orders. So again, they are, the wildfire service can make those recommendations, and they'll provide us ideally with a map of the area that they're concerned about, but we're the ones actually making the decision on what areas are going to be put on, having the legal authority to do so, putting out the actual legal maps, things like that. There can be a bit of push and pull there. Often the wildfire service is looking at it from a firefighting perspective. We're looking at it from the actual human impacts perspective. So, sometimes we'll get boundaries provided to us that just don't make sense in terms of where people actually live in an area. So we will tweak that here and there. But theoretically, we could just outright, not follow their recommendation as well, depending on what's going on. But I think it'd have to be a pretty extraordinary situation for that to happen. If there have been structures damaged in a wildfire, TNRD staff, it is our responsibility to go out and conduct what's called a rapid damage assessment. It could be from a helicopter, it could be on the ground, in terms of surveying what has been impacted, and then that data is then used for us to reach out to people so that they can be made aware of what's happened. In wildfires, it's generally, our experience has been, it's fairly binary. You know, there's, you know, a house is either still standing or it's gone. There's not a whole lot of in between. Whereas with flooding or other events, there is a bit more nuance to it in terms of, you know, is the foundation impacted, things like that. So often with wildfire events, this is something that can be done, you know, from the air, because it'll be pretty readily evident what's happened. Mike had mentioned emergency support services, so ESS. So these are the folks, volunteers who set up the reception centers for evacuees, and take them in and try to get them set up with services and support. We have 5 ESS teams in the TNRD. They are based out of the member municipalities, but they are coordinated and supported by our program. And then we also have a memorandum of understanding with the city of Kamloops. So we help fund one of their staff positions who's dedicated to ESS coordination and training. And then a big factor for wildfire events is livestock, and came to mind with Director Houghton's comments. There's some absolutely catastrophic impacts to livestock and ranching, especially when we have events of the scale of what we had last year, in terms of, in some cases, unfortunately, the loss of livestock, but just the general displacement, the cost of having to house them elsewhere, the loss of rangeland that was experienced in many areas. And part and parcel with that, we also had some extraordinarily high prices for hay last summer as well. So that was all quite a consideration. There is an ability to livestock can be evacuated under an evacuation alert. The province will support that. So we did have situations where we were putting alerts in early or keeping them on later than we normally would have, because there wasn't necessarily a threat to public safety, but we didn't want to take away that support for folks who had their livestock evacuated. And unfortunately, the way the structure of the system right now is that we had to keep that evacuation alert in basically as a tool to ensure those people were still supported. And over to Mike.
So as opposed to wildfire, there is no ministry of flood. Flooding really falls down to the governments of jurisdiction. The province leans in, provides a lot of support in forecasting and coordination around the flood threats. They do have some subject matter experts that we can access, but generally speaking, the governments of jurisdiction are the lead for floods. So that's a big challenge for every government inside of the province. A lot of the resources that we'll need to utilize for flooding are in the contracting communities. So we're looking at professional hydrologists and engineers to tell us what to do and when to do it. The TNRD is prepared to engage on the ground to assist with some of those flood works, and we've certainly seen that in some previous events. Last year, I think it was Savanaugh, where we deployed some flood protection assets there. Floods can be, you know, a slow building type of event where we're watching it on the gauges and the web pages and, you know, obsessively refreshing the snowpack information. Or, you know, as we tragically saw, sudden onset events from severe storms. So they take a lot of different flavors in the province. The TNRD does have a good flood policy. The basis of that flood policy is really that private property owners are responsible for their own private property. We supply sand and sandbags, but the expectation is if you know you live next to a stream that floods, that you should be doing something on that stream so you don't flood. There are other supports when that doesn't work, and you know, we're particularly interested in communities, infrastructure, cultural values. There's a bunch of things that are really key. Private property is ultimately the private property owner's responsibility as the first step. And the TNRD's flood policy is really good and does, it's a good decision support, and it's a pretty sound policy. I think we're getting pretty close to 11:30, so I'm going to hurry this up a bit. Hazardous materials, you'll quite facetiously hear people talk about ethyl methyl bad stuff. The wide variety of things that will spill. If you are on a transportation corridor, this is a real hazard. Highways, railways. I think I've covered off pretty much the entire RD. We routinely see tanker or semi trucks go into the river. This causes water problems. We need to start turning off water systems. Public alerting becomes a big issue. We need to let people know that there's a potential hazard. If you have a straw in the water and are drawing water, you need to be notified that you should not do that at that point in time. So impacts our transportation infrastructure, and TNRD will certainly be engaged in coordinating that. The big key in BC, it's the spiller who pays. If you're transporting hazardous materials, you are responsible for having an emergency plan, and you are responsible to ensure that there is a response. Ministry of Environment engages, but it's actually the spiller who's ultimately at the pointy end of that stick. So the big thing coming down the pipe at emergency programs everywhere in BC is the Emergency Program Act is being rewritten. So the fundamental playbook that we operate by, it was written in 1996. Things have changed dramatically in the emergency management world since 1996. So there is a rewrite that's been going on. It was delayed due to COVID. So it's actually a couple of years outstanding now, but we expect to see something fall 2023. Looking for some big changes. Expect that disaster risk reduction and reflection of the Sendai framework will be incorporated into the new Emergency Program Act. Right now, it's very much a response-focused item. Well, we recognize that we can do response generally. It's mitigation, it's recovery, it's preparedness. These things are not talked about in the current legislation, and we're quite hopeful that there's going to be some support for those pillars of emergency management in the new act. This is likely going to put some obligations onto the governments of jurisdiction. So there will be some more things that we need to do. Risk identification is certainly something that's been talked about an awful lot. And we'll see what that looks like in the new act. There's going to be a lot of focus on working collaboratively with our First Nation neighbors, incorporating Indigenous knowledge and working in collaboration and cooperation, and a duty to consult. So that'll be on the EM planning side of the house as well as the response side of the house. There's going to be specific supports that we've heard about to allow us to respond to culturally significant sites. Critical infrastructure owners are going to have some obligations. Currently, carriers of dangerous goods have some obligations, but they're talking about other critical infrastructure owners. And what does that mean? Recognition of volunteers. Emergency management runs on the backs of our volunteers. They are a critically important resource in emergency management, and they're not mentioned in the current act at all. So we expect to see some inclusion of volunteer roles and obligations and protections in the new act, and some new tools. You saw 300 orders and alerts in 2021. That means every 7 days, they had to renew the state of local emergency. And typically, the wisest practice is a state of local emergency is declared by electoral area. So this was how many states of local emergency need to be renewed every 7 days. It was really quite, it's a logistical nightmare, because if you miss the signing deadline, well, now you have to do a whole net new state of emergency. You can't renew something that lapses. You have to start again. So, that creates other headaches. So having 14 days is going to be a good thing. They're also talking about a period of time where they're calling it recovery transition. So that we'll be able to take some of the emergency powers in through recovery for a certain period of time and not have to continually renew states of local emergency. It's going to be a good thing, because as long as you're under a state of local emergency, there's a public perception to that. And the sooner we can get rid of a state of local emergency, the better it is for people's mental wellness, and it allows you to resume and actually recover.
And what can kind of factor into some of the complications with that is, the state of local emergency is signed off by either our chair or vice chair or a designate, but it actually has to go all the way up to the minister's office before it's actually official and signed and returned. So there's an extra layer of complication in there. And, we had an active evacuation order still in place for parts of the Highway 8 corridor until a few weeks ago. So every week, Chair Gillis and administrative staff had to have that re-signed off on and resubmitted to the province for more than a year. So, that's still going to be a factor, but at least being able to do it 2 weeks at a time instead of 7 days at a time will be helpful. I'm sure Director O'Connor is all too familiar with this, as obviously there is still a state of local emergency for the village too. So I'll touch on this briefly, because we're going to kind of really get into the weeds on this at our February committee of the whole meeting. But we also certainly have to get our house in order administratively here in terms of some of our legislation at the TNRD level. Our emergency program bylaw is one that's been kind of amended over time, mainly as new municipalities became part of the agreement. There's 7 of them right now, but there, quite frankly, isn't really a clear kind of codified list of roles, responsibilities, who's responsible for what, things like that. So we do want to get that in order. There's a few other pieces we need to clean up just in terms of how our bylaws are currently set up. So again, we're going to come to the committee of the whole in February with kind of a more kind of full report and discussion on that. One thing to note is we did previously have an emergency management and protective services committee that was made up of members of the board. That was collapsed this year along with a number of other committees. It met twice a year, and one of the main things that they were responsible for not approving but considering was the grant and aids that we provide to our local search and rescue teams. So instead, those will just be coming directly to the board for consideration, which will actually make the process a bit more streamlined anyway. And then, thank you. And then something we're quite excited about. You've heard about the ongoing renovation plans, both for the civic building and for our Mission Flats yard as well. A pretty key component of that is going to be having a purpose-built EOC facility that's going to be on the 3rd floor here. So previous to that, we've had to set up EOCs depending on the size in this room. Or if we're dealing with a smaller number of staff, we were utilizing the sagebrush boardroom, which is the one on the 3rd floor on the far side of the building there. Certainly challenges with both rooms, obviously chief among them, we had to displace the board and for 73 days straight, that could become a logistical issue. There was also just issues in terms of the connectivity of this room. If you had come in here last summer, it was just an absolute rat's nest of cables and IT equipment and things all over the place. So to have a purpose-built room is going to be great. These are going to be 2 separate rooms with a partition wall in the middle. So we can still have them as meeting rooms outside of EOC activations. If we have a smaller scale one, we can use one half of it. If we need the whole thing, we can break that wall out. We're looking at options in terms of how that room is going to be kitted out. Just to ensure we've got redundant communications, things like that. And then the operations department for the staff who work out of this building are going to be working adjacent to this room. So we're all going to be in the same place. Mike and I's offices will kind of double as breakout rooms for additional sections. There's going to be open workspaces against the south wall as well. So It's just going to really go a long ways to having a much better space for us to set up in. And as Scott mentioned, you know, there's long stressful days in there. So trying to kind of have the right facility for it, it's going to go a long way. And then, well.
Oh, and yeah, the last, what are more priorities? Everything seems to be a priority. So we've already started training with some of the member municipalities. They're going to be doing some EOC refresher training, as you know, Kevin mentioned. Across the province, the TNRD has already been looked at as an organization who's good at this. Practice makes perfect, unfortunately, and you know, I think, you know, Kevin and team damn near got to perfect last year or 2021. So doing some pre-org, making sure we know where the sand's coming from, where the people are going to come from, make sure that we've got some engineers in our back pocket. Already starting to monitor snowpacks and, you know, start to look at river levels. On a call with Environment Canada and climate change yesterday. We're still not out of the drought. About this time of year, we've usually got about a quarter of the snowpack that we're going to see on the ground, and with the exception of a few stations in the North Thompson, where's the snow, is pretty much what the folks are telling us. So maybe looking at a bit of a dry season, but it's way too early to tell. So now it's just start looking at the weather and the snowpacks, and you know, obsessively compulsively looking at where the threats are, and starting to meet with our partners. And you know, again, we like to refer to it as the alphabet soup of ministries. Everybody's got their acronym. So BC Wildfire, Emergency Management and Climate Readiness, the EMBC changed their name, got a new ministry this year. Ministry of Transportation Infrastructure, Ministry of Environment, non-governmental organizations, the RCMP. Everybody has, well, my favorite three-letter acronym, of course, is TLA, which is the three-letter acronym for three-letter acronym. So everybody has one, and you'll see it a lot. But so we are engaging already, even though we're not partway through winter. We're already looking at spring. So I think that's pretty much it, and we'll take any questions.
Yeah, and it's interesting when we talk about the forecasts and the modeling. I think we all wish there was the crystal ball that we could kind of look into and know what's happening. But you know, the fact of the matter is, like I said, this past summer, all the ingredients were there, both for freshet season in terms of extraordinarily high snowpack. That didn't materialize into anything other than some isolated flooding here and there. And with the fire season as well, we had some very warm temperatures, but it didn't take hold. Whereas, you know, if we were sitting here on June 29th of last year, we wouldn't have had any idea what was around the corner for us. And similarly with, you know, November 13th of last year, we wouldn't have had any idea that hopefully once in a lifetime atmospheric river event was around the corner. So we do put a lot of stock in those forecasts, and it's our job to be monitoring them and be aware, but we do have to be ready for those events that, you know, come out of left field as well.
We're not the pair to ask what could go wrong.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that very high level overview. And we do have time for a few questions. If we don't get to all the questions today, then both gentlemen will be available to answer your questions. If you want to send them an email or talk to them afterwards. So
well, I'm sure we'll be here and enjoying some pizza ourselves. So yeah,
you can get them while they put their mouth full of pepperoni. So I've got Director Stamer, I've got Director Houghton. So go ahead, Director Stamer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks so much for the presentation, guys. A couple of quick ones. When are we going to get an opportunity to talk to BC Wildfire Service? Because speaking of TLAs, they're really good at CYA. So maybe we can get them to come and give us a presentation on what happened in 2022. And the other one I thought of, when you brought up a really good point, Mike, about livestock, have we ever thought about purchasing hay in the spring, whether we're going to identify areas like the North Thompson Fall Fire and Rodeo Association, which we used for staging areas, possibly to maybe get ahead, because, you know, there are shortages. And then if we don't use it, we can sell it in the fall. Like, is it something that you guys have thought about or planned about?
Yeah, so Madam Chair through to Director Stamer. So yeah, in terms of BC wildfire, we did typically have them come in kind of twice seasonally, for a debrief and a look ahead at the next year. So yeah, that's something we can look into. Obviously, it'll be with that EMPS committee not there anymore. We'll have to look at whether it's a fit for committee of the whole or whether we have them come to the board. But yeah, noted, and I think that's an important thing for us to keep in the loop. On the hay side, so I mean, as a as the regional district, we don't have the funds to do that ourselves, and I'll kind of defer to Mike, but the province, unfortunately, the nature of the current legislation is that funding doesn't really unlock until arguably it's almost too late, right? Once there's an imminent threat there, and that's really the crux and the challenge of it right now. So there likely wouldn't be funding available for us to do that proactively, even though it would make all the sense in the world to have that stockpile. But Mike, maybe you've got some input on that.
Well, and so haven't seen a pre-org to that nature previously. The current situation, and there is a gap when we're talking about agricultural animals. There's so once we go into an alert stage, there's support to evacuate and feed livestock, assuming they're farm animals. And a farm animal is defined by the government as, owned by a farmer, which means you're making 50.01% of your income from your farm. If you have 2 cows and a horse, those are looked at as pets. And there is no official support for pets. For the farm animals, it's actually pretty easy. The Ministry of Agriculture engages. They've provided tremendous support historically. They work with the Cattlemen's Association, and there's an established rate sheet for, how much it costs to, move a cow and house a cow and feed a cow. And the TNRDs manage that, and we've got a plan to engage with that. And it works really well because nobody knows where, well, you want to know where the hay is, you talk to the cattlemen or the Ministry of Agriculture. And if it's around, they can find it. And the fact that it may become more cost prohibitive in some seasons is reflected on those rate sheets. So we can cover the producers. The gap really falls with the hobby farms, right? The individuals who are using, the 2 cows and the horse as part of their food security. Those are gaps. Maybe reflected inside of the new legislation, do not know.
Thank you, Director Houghton.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I mentioned to Jamie at Sandman, I'll ask you guys, is BC Cattlemen's have made a working agreement with BC Wildfires to assist at the start of a fire and during a fire. So we don't have this locked door policy where you got to get out and wait for us to come in. And I hope that works better in the future, and Wildfires can work with you, Kevin, on that. And I know you've done it in the past in this region, and I think it started in the Caribou when they had that cluster mess a few years ago, was using the assistance of somebody like Reg Stewart to sort of his mentality and his coordination of the in and out policy during a fire, because livestock producers out there in the backwoods are different than somebody that's just got a house, and you can leave your house and go to the Sandman Hotel and survive. But during a fire, the livestock producer has to survive out there and look after his animals and have protocol of when he can go in and when he can't go out. And I hope we can have a really good system. I never want to see another fire, but it is going to happen. And just to let you know, off the topic a little bit, a different group of livestock agencies have purchased 2 livestock emergency response trailers. It's nothing to do with the programs, but if you've ever seen a cattle liner wreck or a gooseneck trailer full of horses get slaughtered by a semi, it's a mess. Usually when that happens, everybody runs and hides in the bush and takes zero responsibility. So a different group of livestock agencies purchase these 2 trailers. I'd like to see 12 of them in the province. They're full of livestock handling equipment. We just unveiled it here this fall. BC Cattlemen's is aware of it. And hopefully we never see a cattle wreck. They had a bad one in Vanderhoof a couple of weeks ago, and I wish we could have had one up there. But and the last thing is, as a director here in the room, the different electoral areas, what would be our role during a wildfire flood as far as assisting you folks? Thank you.
No, Madam Chair, through the Director Houghton. Yeah, so I'm quite proud of the work we did with Cattlemen's last year. So we had Reg in here, I think, on day 2 of the activation. And yeah, you're right. The program was initially kind of championed by the Caribou Regional District in 2017 in terms of access for ranchers to get into the area. So and it was recognized, obviously. So Elephant Hill Fire was kind of straddling the boundaries between TNRD and Caribou, that there were 2 very different processes on either side. So we came on board with that last year. It worked quite well. All the credit in the world to Mike Deedles, who was in our invasive plants program at the time, basically came into the EOC and took over kind of that livestock desk essentially for the whole summer. And we did an incredible amount of work in terms of getting folks in and trying to support them. It's an issue that I think ranchers and folks in the agricultural sector understand it, but I don't think the public has a conception of how huge an issue it was. So no, we've been in regular contact. Kevin Boone and I presented at the Emergency Preparedness Conference a few months ago in Vancouver. They're doing a lot of great work as well. So no, it's definitely one where and your point around the kind of third-party agencies buying up their own equipment. I mean, we saw that a lot to Mike's previous point. You know, Ministry of Agriculture was great in terms of getting in there, but you saw so many just convergent volunteers within the industry, people who know each other. They're calling each other, they're going on Facebook. People are getting up at 3 a.m. and moving animals around of their own accord. So, you know, there's the government response, and, you know, we have to fit within our boxes, but there's also a big one that happens just kind of organically, you know, in the area. On the third piece, just around the elected officials. So yeah, it's going to depend on where it is. You know, I look at an area like yours, right? You know, it could be something happening in Knutsford, could be Stump Lake, could be Monty Lake. So yeah, it's going to depend on the situation, but generally we're going to be in close contact with you. You're probably going to have better contacts on the ground than we do in terms of folks who are out there who might have situational awareness, who might be able to get us information about what's actually going on. So no, we'll be in close contact, but yeah, it will depend on the situation. But yeah. Right. Yeah, absolutely.
The City of Kamloops directors have something else that they have to go to, so they're ducking out. And I know that pizza is either on the way or here or something, and I do not want to stand between people and pizza. So Director O'Connor, you had a question, and Director Thorpe, if you can keep them both very short. Okay.
Yes, I don't have a question. I have more of a comment, but earlier this week I met with ADMs from the new EMBC about our state of local emergency. So we've been in Seoul for 1.5 years, and I just got my email saying to sign off again for this week. But they indicated that they may be producing something else that's not called a state of local emergency, but state of local something else. So that doesn't have to happen.
I think that's probably in reference, in reference to the new Emergency Program Act and what they were referring to as the recovery transition period.
Okay.
So that's it's coming, but I don't think it's going to come soon enough for you.
Yeah. And it won't be something, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think until the new legislation is actually adopted, it will still be in the 7-day. Unfortunately. Yeah.
And Director Thorpe.
Again, mine's more of a comment through the chair to Director Stamer. I think one of the things that we have to do is exactly what Mike said. We need to engage volunteers There are a lot of volunteer groups like CDART and BC and Alberta Livestock Evacuation. When we're talking about hobby farmers and about having supplies on hand, I think we need to utilize them far more than we have, and that they're an excellent resource. Thank you.
And one thing I just want to add, Mike reminded me of it just in terms of Director Houghton's comments. A critical thing that we'll likely be pulling on the elected officials for is when we are doing public meetings. So if we're doing in-person meetings in the communities that have impacted, and certainly Director Ranta did quite a bit of this in 2017, having the elected official there, almost as a moderator, is critical. That's great. We obviously with COVID, we were doing a lot of that electronically in 2021, and just given that we were talking about fires across the whole region, but once we're kind of in those specific community examples, yeah, that'll be a key part.
I think that the expression that we hear is in times of crisis, it's an opportunity for leaders to lead. And people want to see their elected leaders leading. And the public meeting is a wonderful opportunity to do that. And that's a general standard practice, is when there's an impacted population, we try to get a public meeting together so everybody can, express what they're feeling and get the information they need, and having elected leadership there is a real key to success. Exactly.
The flip side of that though, too, is I've heard someone say, if there's a fire in my community, I don't want to hear from the mayor. I want to hear from the fire chief. So that's just something to bear in mind too. It's balancing that leadership role without trying to hog the camera or the microphone or the head table or whatever, and realize that in a crisis, yes, people want to hear from their elected leaders. Absolutely. They want to hear, but they want to hear from the experts who can tell them things like what's happening with the fire, when can we go home, what are the hazards we need to look after. So it is a balancing act, but there obviously is a huge role for elected officials in emergencies. Director Smith and I have decided that, or Vice Chair Smith and I have decided that there aren't going to be any over the next year, so we're going to be good. But it was very pleasing to me that my first official signing duty as chair was to sign the all clear order for properties on Highway 8 that were affected by last year's atmospheric river, which was very nice to sign, but also a sign of how long these things can go on for, something that Director O'Connor knows all too well, sadly, Director Thorpe, others in this room. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. As I said, if you have any questions, certainly feel free. I see CAO Helderbrand wants to say something, but I will just say this is our last meeting. So Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, enjoy the pizza, and we'll see you all in 2023.
Thank you, Chair Roden. I just wanted to say a Merry Christmas to the board on behalf of staff as well. The pizza is available. I know that some of you probably can't stay. We are going to do a long service awards ceremony at 1 o'clock. If you can't be here, we are recording it. We will send it out to you, but there's 19 staff members that represent about 275 years of service that we're going to just acknowledge them today. So thanks and Merry Christmas to everyone.
Yeah, we stand adjourned. Thank you.